It's the 25th of February 2017. I'm Mark Turin, and it is my distinct pleasure to have the chance to talk to and learn from Regna Darnell, Distinguished University Professor at the University of Western Ontario in London, Ontario, and we are here in Regna's home in London itself. Regna, could I start with some very basic questions about where you were born, when, and to whom?
Yeah. I was born in July 1943. Grew up in Cleveland, Ohio. Grew up in Rocky River, which is essentially a suburb thereof. I have always known that I was adopted, and it's never been a problem for me. My parents were. That was the period when children who were adopted were supposed to be possibly the children of those people. They did it that way. So I figured that the ethnic descriptions and other things apply to me, despite the fact that it isn't genealogical. My father was of German and Irish descent. His father was a railroad engineer in rural Ohio. He worked for all of his career for Ohio Bell Telephone, going from climbing poles to a modest low-level managerial position. He did have a bachelor's degree in business. From his description of it, he spent most of it being an athlete. He did track. Not an intellectual, I think we could say. My mother made it out of high school, started finishing school, and her mother was killed in a car accident, so she went home to take care of father and younger brother. That family was of German and Scottish descent, so I figure it's not Scotch-Irish, I'm very careful to say. There are pieces from both directions. There really wasn't any extended family when I was growing up because most of them were gone on both sides, and no, there just wasn't much extended family. And the ones there were, we saw maybe once a year. So it was a very nuclear family, suburban, monochromatic kind of world, I suppose.
Could I ask a little more about the circumstances of your adoption and how old you were?
At birth. And I've always figured I don't need to know that story because it was in the middle of the Second World War, and one could imagine a number of scenarios that would make that impossible. So I've never looked. I had parents. Never thought I needed to. And I've kind of made my own family over my life in terms of people who are to all practical purposes family, and then my own children and grandchildren, and students and former students, and so on.
Do you or did you have brothers and sisters?
No. And my parents were somewhat older. Dad was between the two world wars, so never served in any of them. So I had no sense of any kind of North American history that had an impact on the way I grew up. It was just, every day was like the other ones and you didn't think about it. I didn't really discover that there was a world out there till I went away to school, to college.
Can you describe a little bit more the circumstances of your growing up, of your childhood? Was it peaceful and relatively happy, if, as you described,
Yeah, I guess so. I have very few specific memories. I remember being panic-stricken when I started school I wouldn't be able to learn to read because it seemed like a miracle that people could do that. I figured out how to read and spent the rest of my first 18 years with my nose in a book, I guess. Fiction mostly. There was a tiny little public library in town, and I aspired to read every book in it. I was about 10 or 11 when my mother had to go and explain to them that I'd read everything in the children's section and I needed an adult card. So they dug out all the paper cards and checked, and I had in fact signed out everything that they wanted to have a look at. So they gave me a grown-up card. My parents never looked at what it was I was reading, so they had no idea. And that went along okay for a few years, but then I discovered the Cleveland Public Library and reassessed my priorities to read everything. It was considerably larger.
Were your parents supportive of your intellectual and bookish pursuits, and how did they come to terms with having such a studious daughter?
I think Mother would have liked to have a sort of roughly frilly girly girl, which I wasn't. My dad thought that it would be good for me to have an education in case I ever found myself in a position to have to support myself, but I think he assumed I would get married and someone else was supposed to do that. I suppose if I'd had brothers, there would have been less encouragement, but since I didn't, they thought that going to school and doing well in school was okay.
In your youth, aside from your parents and the nuclear family you describe, were there other important influences, whether relatives, neighbours, school teachers, who stimulated you and
A
encouraged
couple
you?
of teachers, but mostly in high school. High school English teacher was a friend of sorts. Encouraged me to play and read all kinds of strange things, which I did.
What did summer holidays consist of as a child?
We spent quite a bit of time on the Lake Erie Islands. My dad had he liked to build things and fix things, so we had an old cabin cruiser and kind of wandered around to the various islands, which is fun. I haven't been back to most of them for a long time, but that was a nice piece of childhood. So I spent a lot of time sitting in trees reading books and daydreaming. We had a dog for a number of those years, or something that purported to be a dog. It was very small. It wasn't his fault, though. He had a good heart, despite being a silly-looking little critter. And we spent a lot of time walking. I tried to teach him to walk with roller skates, and he didn't care for that. He also didn't care for riding a bike and sitting in the basket, but we did a lot of that, too. If you're going to the library, you want the bike to cart the books on.
Did you have some formative friendships with other children that stayed with you through life?
No. Very few people I kept in touch with. There was a Girl Scout thing that I did through high school and got involved in city scouting. That went better because I didn't have the reputation of being smart. That wasn't a good thing to be if you were a girl in a Midwestern public town in the late 50s. It just wasn't. So I could be just me, whatever that meant, if people didn't know me in a school context. So I got along okay with people, but I didn't really have a social life outside of school.
You already referred to college and the transition there. Was it clear to you and your parents that you were definitely going to college? And was there support
they seem to have taken that for granted. I remember asking at some point if we could afford for me to do that. My father thought that was hilariously funny. But he was so controlling about a good Germanic tradition of dad's in charge kind of thing. And so I really had no idea until the last years of his life when I ended up with power of attorney what anything about his way of running the family might have been.
Had your parents gone to college?
Well, Dad did his track thing, and Mother was at something called Southern Seminary for 4 months after high school, and that was it.
So was the house a religious house, a musical house? What were the...
It was I was raised in the Methodist church with no particular valence. You went to church, kids went to Sunday school. I don't ever remember having a conversation about religion with either of my parents. Very kind of... If you took it seriously, well, I did, I guess, for a period, try to take some of the stuff that came through the church seriously, and then I decided that it was really quite hypocritical, and I wasn't very interested in that. and wandered off. And when I got to college, I ran into Quaker Philadelphia, and that resonated much better with who I was.
Did your parents have aspirations for you that you had to manage and conform to in some way?
I don't know. They lived in a world where adults and children were separate species. And growing up, I never really wanted to be an adult. But they were very close to each other in a sort of division of labor, 1950s. Housewife stays home, and husband goes off and makes money, and so on. And I just never got included in any kind of decisions or discussion. There may have been discussions, but I don't know about them, and I still don't. And there weren't other people having conversations that I could eavesdrop on, so my eavesdropping skills didn't develop until I was doing fieldwork in anthropology, actually.
How did you choose the college to go to, and where did you go?
Well, we spent a summer going around to a few. I wanted very much to go to a girls' school because I had not enjoyed being a smart woman in a public school where football was the big deal. I just couldn't seem to figure out how to make anything out of that was very satisfying. And so we went around one summer and visited a number of East Coast girls' schools, and the one that I liked and eventually got into was Bryn Mawr. The day we went there, it was raining, and it looked like something out of one of those old British murder mysteries that I had read a good number of by that point in my life, and it felt good. No particularly logical reason for it. As it turned out, it was a wonderful choice. Bryn Mawr in those days had half of its faculty women. This is 1961 to 1965. There was just no place else that did that. And they were incredibly highly ranked academically as women's college or women's side of co-ed, like Barnard at Harvard and so on. So it really did turn out to be a good place to grow up. If you looked at the freshman class, you had this feeling that it would be interesting to see if they all turned out to be functional adults. It was a real collection of, well, about half prep school, and then about half just strangely from all over.
And while the faculty were half women, what about the student body?
Well, that was all women.
Entirely.
By the time I left, they were starting to take a few graduate students who were male. When I was there, it was 750 undergraduates and 300 graduate students. So, of course, you knew everyone in your class and most of the people in adjacent ones. And almost everyone lived in dorms on campus. So it was a very possible to interact with people at a whole bunch of levels.
What year did you start at Bryn Mawr?
61.
Can you remember your first days or weeks?
Yeah. I figured I was so lucky to get in that I clearly wouldn't do very well, but as long as I could pass, that would do. And I never cared much about marks anyway. I never had, really. Just missed graduating magna cum laude by a very small percentage of a point. It hadn't occurred to me that might happen. First week, yeah. Well, I was going to be an English major. And the English course was dreadful. No matter how good you were at English, they made you take freshman comp, essentially. And that was demoralizing. So the course that was fun was anthropology.
Did you know about anthropology before?
Never heard of it.
What enticed you into a classroom with a title of a subject you didn't know?
Well, I had signed up for psychology and philosophy in English, and German, because I thought that my father would be very pleased if I learned German. I walked into the first meeting of the German class. There were 5 of us, and the other 4 already spoke German. This was not for me. So I went dashing over to the dean's office and said, okay, what else can I take? Looked at a few descriptions and said, let's try that one. which turned out to be Anthropology 100 with Frederica de Laguna, who was Franz Boas's last PhD student and worked on the Northwest Coast with the Thlinkit. And so things just kind of evolved from there. I ended up doing a double major in medieval English and anthropology, doing almost a grade point better in average in the anthropology courses. English in those days was very text. What do you mean? You're writing social science papers, that isn't English. And they kept wanting me to read secondary criticism, and I didn't like that. It bored me. I wanted to read the stuff and decide what I thought about it. So, of course, I did that, and then I kept being told that I needed to cite. Apparently, I reinvented many critics' positions. And once the professors realized that that was what was going on, they left me alone, but, whatever.
When you took this anthropology class, did you think instantly, this is for me?
I knew it was the best course I was taking that year. I don't know, it's not quite that simple, I guess, but yes, in a way. It was a very small department. There were 11 majors. It was in principle joint sociology and anthropology, mostly because of the size. But I never took a sociology course, and Freddie de Laguna, who was the chair, was not basically on speaking terms with the chair of sociology, so there was no intersection. It was a neat place to be because the faculty were all available to students. You didn't even have to be taking a course from them, so you kind of wander into somebody's office and talk to them, which many of us, most people I think, did in one way or another. Certainly I did. And the dorms were so mixed that you were always talking to people who were in different disciplines and doing different kinds of things. And so it came together nicely.
Who were your other influences, intellectually or personally, at college?
Well, let's see. One of the stories that I often tell my own students is about the science requirement. Everybody had to take a science. So I and most of the other English majors took geology, which I've actually ended up using more than I would have thought. I wouldn't have thought so at all, actually. But I remember the last lecture when the professor came in and said, now, this isn't on the syllabus, but I want to tell you about something that I think is going to be really important in a few years. And the lecture was on plate tectonics, which is kind of neat. That wasn't in the curriculum in those years, and I have checked with people who know things about the development of those fields, and he was really pretty far ahead of things. And almost no one in that class would ever take another geology course. But he felt like he needed to tell us that it was an evolving field where ideas mattered, and I've somehow always seen that as a kind of ideal for something. And then my fourth year, A. Irving Hallowell, Pete, taught a course. His pension from Penn wasn't going very far, and he decided he needed to teach a course. So he was teaching at Bryn Mawr, and between him and Freddie, my fourth year, I was taking history of anthropology and culture and personality. And Freddie's mother, Grace de Laguna, who was a philosopher who did a lot of stuff on speech acquisition, was also in and out of things. So there's a very vibrant kind of community. And the students in anthropology had all their courses together because you had to take everything the department offered every year. They made it work at all by having one appointment that they hired someone for 1 or 2 years who would do random stuff. My random was a course in anthropology and the classics, which was really fun. I've always wanted to do a graduate seminar at Western on such a thing, but the comp lit department can't cope with it, and theory really can't either, so I never did get around to that one. Good stuff, though. And in the same sense that my medieval English was an exercise in culture for me. And some of the things I did there, they'd be okay in an English department today, but they weren't then.
In the anthropology that you were reading and learning, was it a clearly Americanist tradition, or was it pointing back to Europe? Who were you reading? Who were the intellectual influences of the field at that time?
It was basically read everything. I have read the basic literature as of 1965 in the discipline of anthropology, mostly sociocultural. Um, we really didn't. We had a course in American archaeology, which I took from Freddie, and we had a course in physical anthropology, which I did not take. But I have some vague memory of an assignment where we had to go to the Philadelphia Zoo and observe a primate and write a paper about it, which is actually a very hard thing to do because you have to decide how much you're going to anthropomorphize. Interesting. I mean, either you've got a completely so-called objective description, which is dead, or you've got something about what you think these folks are doing. And I am, of course, on the latter camp. But it was fun. The linguistics was really separate, and I never did do anything with that as an undergraduate.
The small classes and the small number of majors that you describe, did that lead to lasting friendships and a very integrated cohort?
Not much. There was one lady that I stayed in touch with for, well, I guess I still am, but not closely anymore, the last few years anyway. But she did one semester of grad school and then decided to go a more practical, applied kind of route. And so we didn't share the networks of professional practice in the same way. And she was doing Latin American stuff, and I ended up doing Native American. It was inescapable because of the people I studied with, I think. There wasn't, I mean, we read the classic British stuff as well as the American. We didn't read much of what was coming out in the ethnoscience kind of frame that, as a grad student, I spent a lot of time thinking about. That just wasn't on the radar. It was a very sort of conventional, old-fashioned, you need to know about all of this stuff, and the odds are I've read it if it was available in that time. And I took notes in a way that I could probably still use many of them.
At what point in your undergraduate studies did you already think of pursuing this further, continuing on to graduate school?
Well, I had to make a decision at the end of fourth year about whether I was going to go on in anthropology or English. The English would have probably been teach English. But I guess I thought about graduate work too. But basically I looked at the people who were majoring in these fields and thought about which ones I'd like to spend the rest of my life talking to, and decided I'd better be an anthropologist.
Can you recall when you imagined that you would have a career as a professor and a researcher? Was there a moment when you thought, what they're doing is what I would like to do?
I don't think there was a moment, no. It just sort of followed. I mean, you do the stuff you're supposed to do and the stuff that's fun, and then the next thing you're supposed to do is something else. So, okay, that might be fun too. I applied to grad school only at Bryn Mawr and at Penn and was accepted at both, and had the sense to know that a bigger place and a change of pace would be good. Freddie, I think, was quite disappointed, but there it is. Although I did stay in touch with her until her death.
So you went to Penn in 65?
Yeah.
To work with whom?
It's hard to remember what I thought I was going to do. Something about culture and personality, I guess, but they weren't really doing that after Pete Hallowell retired. The other person who appeared at Penn the same year I did was Del Himes. And Del was a very down-to-earth critter in a lot of ways, and his idea of professional practice was to get a bunch of students and possibly like-minded colleagues and spend a lot of time talking to each other. And I fell right into that with immense pleasure. So, although most of them were doing mostly linguistic anthropology, and I did all of that work, but I was also doing history of anthropology, and I was the only one who did that. And that was something that Del took very seriously. So, and after working with Pete, And to some extent, Freddie, I really had better training to go in that direction than most people might have.
Who were the other members of the department at Penn at that time in the mid-60s?
Tony Wallace also became a friend. Tony was that. Tony was chair at the time, and not very student friendly. He wasn't shy, but he was very introverted and sort of not inclined to be friendly and sociable, and so very few of the grad students got to know him very well at all. And in those days, he was sort of half-time in the department and half-time at the Eastern Pennsylvania Psychiatric Institute. For a variety of reasons, I did get to know him quite well. I had been doing some work on Iroquois treaty speech, and he turned me loose in his own files out at Epi and let me play, which took a certain amount of faith. I had gotten dragged to several Iroquois conferences by Betty Tooker from Temple, whom I happened to know through my grad school landlady, because one of the people who was taking that course, let's see, how did it go, was working where she did at the Cancer Institute in Philadelphia, Chase Fox. And so it seemed reasonable, because Penn didn't offer anything that gave you the feeling there were real live Indians in the world. And Betty was talking about people she worked with in a very much more interactive way. And so I went and took Betty's course. The oral final, the question she asked me was how to make corn soup, and I was able to tell her. But I wasn't taking it for credit anyway, so it really didn't matter. Anyway, she dragged me to the Iroquois conference several times, and which got me interested in a number of things ethnohistorically and language and culture related to Iroquoian that I followed up through grad school and not again when I went to the prairies thereafter.
You mentioned your graduate school landlady. I believe she was quite an influence in your life. Leaving Bryn Mawr, a small college in dormitories, you moved into the city of Philadelphia. Is that correct?
No. Oh, no. I just went to school in the city of Philadelphia. No, I got married at the end of my junior year, and therefore was living off campus in Bryn Mawr and stayed there until I left town after the PhD. So it was a commute into the city, but still very much part of this funny community. It was a town and gown thing in a way, but Betty's father had been the town barber for centuries, good Italian family. There were 120 members of the Treviglini family in Philadelphia. And they came from a funny little village called Brockaska Lane in the Abruzzi. And Betty was a Drosophila geneticist working in somebody else's lab. But she cooked because when her mother died and she ended up keeping house for her dad and brother, she was taught to cook by the next sister down. There were 7 of them left, 6 sisters and a brother. Aunt Mel became the matriarch. And Betty learned to cook from her, and she never saw a recipe in her life. So there's a woman who's a chemist by day and an Italian cook with a pinch of this and a pinch of that. And some of this, and maybe you put that in, and then again, maybe you don't, kind of cooking style. And I spent a lot of time perched on the counter talking to her. So I learned a lot about what she was sticking into recipes. I also learned to enjoy food in that household and the hospitality of eating well with people. The motto of the house, and the only overtly religious thing that went by in all the years I lived there, was a quotation on the dining room wall from St. Paul's letter to the Corinthians. Take a little wine for your stomach's sake. And we did that. You also spilled a little red wine on the tablecloth so that your guests would be comfortable and wouldn't worry about spilling. I still do that too. Although I do have a fair number of wine red tablecloths, which makes life simpler. Anyway, so I did learn a great deal about cooking. In those days, Kribari Chianti was $2.37 a gallon, and you had to drink it rapidly or you had very good vinegar. So there were a lot of excellent parties. I actually did not drink until well over the legal age of 21, though most of my friends did. Anyway.
You mentioned getting married in your junior year. Can we return to that a moment and ask who, why, what happened?
Well, Bryn Mawr has a twin school down the road, also Quaker Philadelphia founded, Haverford, which is an interesting place. That's co-ed these days, I believe, but it was all men and that boys in that stretch. And the people that I came to know well there were Quaker Philadelphia local kids. This was, of course, the Vietnam era, and I did a lot of rather informal draft counseling. The pacifist position was pretty serious in those days, and I got very involved with the Quaker Philadelphia community in those years. The marriage ended before I left. The year that I finished grad school, essentially. I think it was just that I was so conservative that it seemed that one needed to get married if one was going to have a relationship, and so I did. I don't know, it seems like a long time ago and something that happened to somebody else. I did, however, keep the name because I began to publish under it, and I've always felt that you don't follow your personal career through a series of marriages.
So for the record then, Darnell was the name of your first husband?
Yes.
May we ask, for the record, what your maiden name was?
I suppose so. Diebold, which is German, misspelled by Ellis Island. So somewhere I have the 1837 immigration papers for Josef Diebold. But that was all long gone because the German side of the family were all deceased by the time I was born.
You fast-forwarded rather quickly from marriage to divorce. How long were you together with your first husband?
About 4 years.
And did you have children?
Good Lord, no. That would have been an error. A serious error. On all fronts. I couldn't possibly have been a good parent at that stage in my life. And I'd like to think I did okay when I did get around to it.
Were your parents supportive, of the marriage and then later when you broke up? Or?
Well, my mother's comment was, "We're so relieved, dear." But I don't think they would have liked anyone that I liked, so it really didn't matter. It just different ideas about what made someone interesting or significant. He was a biochemistry student, so a lot of the Haverford guys were science-oriented, but science at Haverford was a very humanistically oriented kind of thing. And so people in different small science departments spent a lot of time talking to each other. So it wasn't as different from the humanities stuff, humanities and social sciences, as it might sound like. One of them was a physics major who ended up going to grad school in physics and switching over to religious studies at Chicago almost instantly. No particular glitch. He was still thinking about the same things. It was that kind of stuff.
At what point in your graduate career at Penn did a research project take shape, and what was it?
Well, for my master's thesis, I really didn't want to do a glorified book report, so I found myself a well-known, or at least significant, Philadelphia anthropologist and went searching for papers. That was Daniel Garrison Brinton, who happened to be part of the Quaker Philadelphia network and was the kind of last guard of pre-Boasian old-fashioned evolutionary something or other. So it was kind of an interesting transition point in the discipline. So my master's thesis was And I began working at the American Philosophical Society archives doing that project, so probably around 1966. Yeah, that's about right. And did a master's thesis. Dell's comment was, "You could get a PhD for this at a second-rate university." I thought he defended me. I was really quite appalled. Then I heard that he was boasting about how good it was to one of his colleagues. And, oh, okay. That wasn't what I got out of it. However, eventually I published that as a book, but it was only when the department pestered me to do it, when they were trying to celebrate the fact that Daniel Brinton's nominal professorship was 1 year before Frederick Ward Putnam's at Harvard. And the anthropology meetings were in Philadelphia that year, and they really wanted to be fancy about it. So I went back and revisited it modestly.
But to be clear then, your master's thesis was an archival exploration. It didn't involve original fieldwork.
My dissertation didn't either. That one was a more general kind of what was going on. It was the days when everybody was reading, in history of science, everyone was reading Thomas Kuhn's Scientific Revolutions, and it seemed to me that the revolution part was somewhat overstated, because there's always a kind of continuity. So I decided to look at the Bureau of American Ethnology, and then here comes Boaz, what happened? So that one took me 30 years to publish as a book, too. I finally did in 1998, rewritten modestly, and updated on references a tad. Whatever. I think it was interesting to show the places where the real innovations came, and where the changes between university and museum support of anthropology, and what kind of government institutions were in there. Boas was an institutional genius at making stuff come together to organize networks of things, and you really could begin to see what was happening. So I spent a lot of time in more archives doing that, and then when I went job hunting, wanted to go somewhere where I could do field work, because I had the sense to know that a real anthropologist has to do field work.
Of your cohort, how many would you say did field work for their graduate degree, and how many had done more archival?
Well, they all did. I mean, all of Dell's linguistic anthropology students, those are the people that contributed, the majority of the people who contributed to the Bauman and Scherzer volume explorations in the ethnography of speaking. I had a paper based on my first year of field work at Alberta in that volume, which came right in there. But yeah, Judy Irvin with the Wolof, Susan Phillips working with Oregon, various groups actually, at Warm Springs. And let's see, Eleanor Oakes, then Keenan, fieldwork in Madagascar for her dissertation. Anne Salmond was from Maoriland. A fellow named Tiwari, who was Indian. He was, I think, registered in linguistics. Joel Scherzer with Kuna. His degree was in linguistics also, but we sort of... An appointment to the graduate school made it possible for you to supervise in any department at Penn, so you didn't have to go through all this nonsense of interdisciplinary permissions to be interdisciplinary, which was nice. So we had a kind of interdisciplinary core of students that hung out together a lot. We ended up over at the Himeses one night a week to do something every week. It was almost always adjourned to ping pong in the basement afterwards, but sometimes guest speakers, a lot of interesting guest speakers, sometimes people talking about their own work. There were several faculty that turned up from here, there, and the other place. The one I got to know best was Dan Van Ames in folklore. So it was a really stimulating place to be in a lot of ways.
You mentioned Dell before, but can you tell us a bit more about how you worked with him and the professional training and mentoring that you received?
Well, for 3 of the 4 years I was at Penn, I was his research assistant 20 hours a week, which basically meant that I knew a lot about most of the pies he had his fingers in, and there were a lot of them. So I learned how to manage a professional career, trying to sort some of that out. And he was very good at taking students to conferences and introducing them to his friends, and it was a very good professional training, I thought. Thought then and still think.
What were the challenges of grad school?
Well, Penn was sort of you're not real till after you pass prelims. Really, I was used to a very small place where you were an individual immediately. That first year was brutal. I just didn't feel good about most of what I was doing. Pete Howell was holding my hand through a great deal of that and sort of saying, no, it'll be all right, dear, don't worry. So I tried not to worry. He came into Penn 1 day a week as a retired faculty member. So I met all the other retired faculty members who had offices in the weird alcoves of the University Museum. Samuel Noah Kramer, John Alden Mason. Let's see, there were more of them. Anyway, that was kind of fun.
Were you a bit of an outlier then for not doing a fieldwork-based dissertation? And how did that situate you in the field at that time?
I don't know that I thought about it a lot, except to know that I would want to do fieldwork eventually. I just didn't want to be a student doing something that wasn't research. And history of anthropology was something you could do while you were sitting around the university, if you were in a city that had really good archival materials. And obviously for my field, the APS was wonderful. And then I did a fair amount of work also at the Smithsonian National Anthropological Archives. So, easy to do that.
What year did you graduate with your PhD?
69.
What happened next?
Got a job. A real life job.
Well,
with Indians.
For those of us who are sometimes still struggling to find positions, what was the situation of the employability of anthropologists in the late 60s?
Well, everybody who came out of the kind of program I did, and I'm not trying to sound like a snob, but Penn had a very good reputation and some very good faculty writing letters for you, and I think everybody got a job, but they no longer got them at Harvard, Berkeley, Columbia, and so on. They got jobs in funny places, some of them. Smaller places, not ridiculously small, but not the institutions that the faculty were used to thinking they could place their students.
Did you apply to a number of different positions?
A few. It was odd. I just figured something would happen, and it did.
Where did you take your first position?
At the University of Alberta in Edmonton, where I discovered that they had Cree, and that would be just fine. I remember telling Pete Howell that I was going to do that and work with the Cree, and Pete said, "Oh, I learned to ride a horse in Edmonton in 1925. I said, okay. And then he said, "It's cold there." That was the sum total of my instruction in field work.
Did you also have offers to stay in the US, or were you quite happy to imagine a move to Canada?
Well, remember, this is a Quaker pacifist sort of critter in the Vietnam era. So I voted in the election of 1968 for Dick Gregory on the Team Peace and Freedom ticket and left town. I campaigned for 6 or 7 different people in that anything but mode. So you're standing on a doorstep saying, "Let me tell you about Eugene McCarthy," and they say, "Oh, McCarthy in South Philadelphia. Haven't heard of him in politics for years. Good plan." And you think, what's my ethical obligation here? I generally took the view that you say, "Good plan, you vote for McCarthy," and wandered off. They, of course, were not talking about the same person. But that's all right.
Can you recall how different or distinct Edmonton in '69 felt from Philadelphia?
Oh, culture shock, absolutely.
Please tell
The
me.
Cree weren't particularly. I mean, I've been immersed in the literature and various things for a long time. I didn't find the native communities all that startling, but Edmonton was something else. Frontier town in a whole lot of ways. Nobody was from Edmonton, for a start. And most of my students there were the first generation in their family, the first people in their family to go to school. Lots of them were really smart, but they didn't know it. And so it was really fun to teach them because you could see the lights go on.
What were you hired to do? Was it an open position, or did it have a particular direction and angle?
Oh, I was supposed to be a linguistic anthropologist, which was fine. So I taught all of the linguistic anthropology courses for 21 years, essentially, from the required second year course semester through to a variety of offerings in second and third year levels to graduate seminars. So, yeah,
Was it a four-field department?
yes, very much, and still is.
Can you describe a little bit more about the work that you then started to do in Edmonton with local communities, Indigenous communities, and how that started, what the point of contact was?
Well, a point one would be to meet some native people and start trying to learn Cree. And one of the grad students at Alberta at that time was someone I knew through that famous Iroquois course with Betty Tooker, who was from Philadelphia. So he said, oh, I know some folks, I'll take you up and introduce you. So I camped out at their place for a long time. We'd kind of teach Tuesday to Thursday and then wander off for their long weekend and try to learn the language and hang out, and eventually did some work with the kindergarten class and a lot of stuff on language acquisition and maintenance. In those days, you couldn't get money to do applied work, so you had to, the grant titles all sound very theoretical, but it wasn't like that in practice. So increasingly, over the years, I was working more with people who wanted to run language classes in communities. In some communities, to teach the kids to write a language they already spoke, and in other communities, really to teach the language. Some of them were really talented teachers and untrained linguists. It was really fun.
Was there a different orientation in the Canadian anthropological tradition to what you've been trained in, or how similar did it feel?
Well, totally different, because Penn was an ivory tower department. This is an intellectual exercise. So you read books and you analyze ideas, and you think about how the discipline has developed, but it didn't have much to do with communities or people because nobody was working locally in any kind of serious way.
So had you actually been well trained, do you think, to be able to engage with communities and develop partnerships, or was it quite a new set of skills you
It
yourself
never
had?
came up. So, yeah, as I said, those two comments of Pete's were the sum total of training and field work.
And were you building a program at Edmonton, or was it a pre-existing unit that they were hiring new people into?
There was a linguistics department that wanted nothing to do with the kind of linguistics one might do in anthropology. And they always refused to list me in the AAA guide as anthropologist in another department. Okay. So I did my thing with my students and developed a course in Cree language and culture. But no, there wasn't a potential to grow it because we didn't have the numbers to justify a second appointment. I mean, they have more people now that do this kind of stuff, but not then. On the other hand, it was a very tail end of the boom kind of thing, so you could get small money to do research. The scale was completely different. If you wanted to talk to the the major political figures in the province, the odds were you could get an appointment the next day. I just very personalized and very small towny in some interesting kind of way, and I liked that. Had never had it before, and it seemed. And then the department was fairly new, so they had just had their graduate program approved. When I went there, there were 5 faculty members, and 3 of us were hired that year. By 1973, we had, I think it was 17 full-time positions. And it was just hire anything that wants to come. Some of them turned out to be really great, and some of them, okay.
Where was the money coming from at that time for the rapid growth of Canadian universities?
Oil. Those were good years for things like that. So it was easy to get things done, and there wasn't, if I'd gone to a department like the one I was trained in, I would not have been able to go off and decide what I was going to do with the same kind of independence, I guess. And I liked that.
What was the funding landscape like in Canada at that time compared to the US? I mean, you were looking for funds to develop language programs, do primary field work. How easy was it?
I didn't need much money. We had something called the Boreal Institute on campus for Northern Research, which is now the Canadian Circumpolar Institute, I believe. That was a long time ago. But I could get $2,000 or $3,000 for a summer to go play. And what I needed was gas money, and, well, it was supposed to be food, but in practice beer, and they fed me because the people who were my major teachers in that first stretch, he was a trapper and hunter, and she was very traditional too. So
what did your first ethnographic work focus on? What were you looking into and exploring?
Language and language acquisition. So I started hanging out with the kindergarten class, which was fun because that first year I did that, there were 23 kids. 19 of them were monolingual Cree at the beginning of kindergarten. Most of those kids had to repeat kindergarten or grade 1 or both, because there were a couple that were sort of bilingual, and then a few non-native kids who were in the community because their families had jobs there.
And were you looking at transitioning children who were Cree speaking at home into English, or were there native language classroom environments in which you were working?
Certainly in that community, I don't think there was ever any Cree language taught. A few years later, I found communities that were trying to develop stuff and got involved with them. That was a different kind of question. But that early field, it really wasn't a problem, because if I didn't get the grant, I didn't really need it anyway. I got paid enough to buy the gas if I had to.
Did those early relationships become lifelong relationships with community members in and around Edmonton?
Some of them did, but they were, I was a kid. I turned 26 10 days after my appointment as assistant professor took effect. So, the elders essentially that I was working with in language sorts of things really weren't around by the time I left. So there wasn't, the world I worked in that field work is just not there anymore in terms of people, because I didn't, I remember some of the children and grandchildren as kids, but I didn't know them as adults, really.
Did you use a fair amount of recording media, film, photography, audio during that time?
Some sort of experimentally, but basically no, because I didn't. Tape recorders got in the way for the kinds of things I was interested in. And I think much more what I came to call interactional etiquette, which I later found out was a term that Clifford Geertz had used also, but I didn't know that. So it doesn't count, or it doesn't for me anyway. And so it was a question of a communicative economy at least as much as the language per se. So a kind of semantics in practice approach. And I didn't need detail for that. I needed to be around and eavesdropping and listening to things that happened. And of course, lots of people didn't have transportation, and I did, so I spent a lot of time. Now, Mary Rose Cardinal would say, "Oh, I've always wanted to go visit my friend up, and it's just over there a little ways. Make sure you got a full tank of gas," and okay, here we go. Sometimes winter roads. I was naive enough not to think about how stupid it was to go roaring off in rotten weather on some of those winter roads. But anyway, so I would drive her over there, which would turn out to be 90 miles down the road, and visit some person that I would have been completely unable to get an interview with as a researcher, but I was there as her friend and chauffeur, and so I got to listen. And so it was a very low-key kind of field work. I've never been into interviews.
Did you find that you took to field work quite easily? Did it come naturally?
I loved it. It was fun. And because I wasn't doing a dissertation based on that early field work, I didn't really have to care a lot what kind of results I had. I said, I'm trying to learn the language. And then just writing some little papers that make it clear that I was doing something. It always shocks me that some of that early work is still cited. Because for me it was a throwaway for what I wanted to do with, well, no, that's not quite fair, but it was not the important part for me. That was the hanging out with the people and getting to figure out what on earth was going on here.
One often imagines the early years of an assistant professor's first appointment as being quite high stress, teaching requirements, research, setting up, living in a new place. You seem to describe a rather effortless and smooth running of operations. Were there challenges that you recall, or what were the
I suppose, but I
hardest
remember
parts?
it as being pretty peaceful. As a young woman in the department, I wandered around in baggy clothes and, let's say, not trying to look like a woman most of the time, both in the field and around the university. There was a fair amount of, I don't know, not deliberate chauvinism and not deliberately keeping you out of things, but there was a funny line. And none of my colleagues were people of my own generation, so the friends that I had were largely Native women that I knew through other means than university network, through the Cree class teaching and through communities where I was working. And
Where did you live in Edmonton? Where did you live, in the city or outside?
In the city for a while, and then eventually, let's see now, when did we? Then we moved to an acreage outside Edmonton, and that would have been, let's see now, I think Kevin was a baby, so my second son, so that would have been the fall of 75, no, fall or spring of 75.
You mentioned
75,
we, so
76.
who-
Oh yeah, I got married again somewhere in there.
To
You start talking about one thing and it goes on. Yes, I married a Slavic linguist, Anthony Vanek, who had a very troubled relationship to the Slavic linguistics department. However, and we did a lot of field work together. Some of it, 3 summers doing some halfway serious work with Doukhobor Russian speakers in southern BC, which was interesting and different. I think it's important for an anthropologist to work in more than one society because you can't be binary about anything when you do that. I would never have the depth in anything except, well, at that point, Cree, that I did in some of these other adventures, but it was kind of it was really useful to put a focus on what was particular to the group I was working with. And then at some point I decided that I was getting much too Creo-centric, so I decided to start studying Southern Slavey, which is an Athabascan language of the Mackenzie Delta, because they're hunter-gatherer traditions, so a halfway similar traditional lifestyle, but the languages are completely different. And if you think in terms of distinctions that are made in Cree that make semantic sense in a cultural way, then you kind of, all right, I thought that I was getting far too into deciding that these crossed all indigenous groups, and so I wanted to test that against Athabascan. And then my old buddy Keith Basso and I concocted this scheme to have a conference to get together our friends who had worked with different American Indian groups and had found, how would you put it? Had found patterns that were similar. But of course, we were all too trained to be ethnographers in this very specific sense to want to say that this is a general pattern. So that eventually produced a book called Native North American Interaction Patterns, which has a couple papers in it that I still think are truly fine. It didn't come out till 1988, which was somewhat after the actual conference. But it was a nice way to sort of say, all right, how do you move from the ethnography to the comparative dimension, which is equally critical to being an anthropologist, I think. And we had Joel Scherzer up the same week as the conference as an external examiner for one of my students. And he, of course, had been working in Panama, the Cuna, and very, very different kind of cultural world. And he said, I know all these people, but I can't talk to them here. Something is wrong. And it was this sort of thing that we shared because we all worked with, in some ways, quite similar groups. And so there were sentences you didn't have to finish. And stories that you heard the punchline coming. So there really is a kind of patterning. But very few people have individually the ability to put it together and make a pattern. So that was fun.
Can we come back to your husband, Anthony Vanek? He was a professor also at Edmonton.
Slavic linguistics.
You met, I trust, at the university?
Yes.
And he was from Canada himself, or recent arrival?
No, he was a Moravian Czech, adolescent during the Second World War. Spent some of that in essentially foster care as farm labor. After the war, escaped to a Western zone where he could apply to go somewhere else, anywhere else essentially. Ended up in the U.S. Army under the Marshall Plan in Korea. Came back on NDAA money to study Slavic languages because round about Sputnik time, that was a good thing to do. And then got involved in somewhat more general linguistics. He edited a journal out of our basement for a number of years, Papers in Linguistics, which I think I've still got a full set of, but a large number of libraries in Canada and the U.S. did subscribe to it. We had, and the Japanese, of course, Japanese by books. It was wonderful. Anyway, I learned a lot about publishing that way, and editing, and book production, however.
You mentioned, in passing, your second son. You had children together?
Yes, we had 4 children together, 2 years apart. I believe single-handedly and still cited as the source of the maternity leave policy at the University of Alberta. When I got pregnant with the first one in 1973, I called up the Faculty Association and said, what's your policy? And they said, our what? We don't have one. Well, what am I supposed to do? Well, I suppose if there's a point where you can't teach your classes, you should get someone to cover them for you, one of your colleagues. Oh, wonderful. This is a great way to make your colleagues feel that you are a colleague. Okay, so I missed one meeting of each class. and negotiated with the department for a bit more TA assistance than I would otherwise have had. Basically for the Cree course, which by that point was meeting in the evening 2 nights a week. And I didn't have to do that if there was a day I just really didn't want to. So also by that point, our adopted grandmother was teaching Cree with me, or beginning to, and so she watched the baby when I couldn't, essentially. It worked. And then when I got pregnant with Kevin in 75, I called them up again because there was brand new provincial legislation that said that they had to give me 3 months off. 3 months? No, I think it was only 3. And at full salary. And so I called them up and said, okay, how do we do this? And they said, we don't know. No one's ever asked for it before. Yeah, for real. So I negotiated my way through some extra help with teaching that time, too. By the third one, I was just coming off a sabbatical, and I was so pissed off with their lack of a policy that I decided I was taking it. I didn't care how they did it. So I took 3 months off when my third son, Adam, was born. And so I've been a year and a half out of the department. And then I found out what was the matter with the maternity leave policy, which is that they do in fact have to give you the leave, but they do not have to maintain the continuity of the program you're responsible for. So I lost a whole generation of students because stuff wasn't taught. I mean, they found someone to do the required course for the undergraduate program, but the rest of it just went, whatever, she's not here. So we don't do it. And then with the fourth one, I just took her with me. By that point, I had enough confidence to figure, oh, well, this will be fine.
So you brought her to the university to classes?
Most of the time, yeah.
Were you one of only a handful female faculty in the early 70s in Edmonton?
Well, no, there were some. But in our department, none of them had similar personal circumstances. There was a lady who was already a grandmother who taught courses for us. Linda Fettigan, as a physical anthropologist, had no children, and we really didn't have much to do with each other anyway because what we do was so different. And then there was Ruth Gruen, married to Alan Bryden. They were both archaeologists of a very Harvard old school, different generation. I got along fine with them, but Ruth was not someone that would be moral support for raising a family as a young professional. So, yeah.
Sounds quite challenging. Was Anthony involved as a father and active, or did you have other forms of help?
I had Grandma. Grandma was pretty special.
Can you tell us a bit about Grandma?
Well, one of my friends found her through her son, because they used to go sit in bars together, as someone who lived in the city and was a fluent Cree speaker, and would I like to meet her? And yes, I would. So, and we hit it off. She was from an area where essentially I had worked, from the Big Stone Band at Wabasca Desmarais originally, but had lived in the city for a number of years. Nobody in particular, no real formal education, but she'd had a lot of jobs keeping house for 4 people and working as a cook in camps. So she was really very good as someone to collaborate in teaching because I couldn't co-opt her judgment of anything. I'd go off on these diatribes about linguistic problems or cultural theories, and she'd sort of stare into space till I got done and then go back to, how do you say this? Oh, like this. That's not what you said last year. Oh, okay, let's see where that goes. It was a very open-ended kind of class in which about a third to a half of the students were Cree by the time I finished. I did that for 15 years, most of them with Grandma. And she would she would basically follow my lead about what we were going to cover, but her interactions with the students were just, I mean, it was things like she would never say you were wrong. She would just keep repeating it until she liked what you said a tad better. And she just wouldn't criticize anyone. So they learned an enormous amount about traditional manners from Grandma, which was not on the curriculum. It was just, we called it Cree language and culture because there was a lot of that in there. And if we ran into something that either she wasn't sure about or seemed to be a problem, or there seemed to be disagreements among the speakers, not all of the Cree students in the class actually spoke the language. And so they would all scatter home to reserves around the province to consult Granny. And then they would come back for the next class, and we would have a discussion about the 6 different grannies' opinions of how you say something like ashtray. As opposed to by translating ash and tray, it's something about the locationals of something falling, which is a very Cree way of thinking about it. But each of these ladies constructed that differently, because obviously it wasn't a word that they learned growing up themselves. So stuff like that, it really was fun.
But you described her also as part of your personal life. Did she live with you and your family, or did she?
No, but I would drop the kids off, and then when I went to, and then pick them up on my way home, and then we'd sit and have tea, and it meant someone to talk to about raising kids, and so I don't consider that field work, but I guess it was in one sense, or it certainly went into my understanding of Cree worlds a great deal. And she considered my children among her grandchildren. That wasn't a problem at all. She called me daughter-in-law rather than daughter because she didn't raise me. But I was her daughter in the same sense that her son's wife was. They split and she kept the wife. Well, kept the son too at some level, but it was an interesting world.
Can you reflect a little on how you worked at that time, raising a young family, having classes to teach, being in a department that sounds like it wasn't particularly supportive of a young female professional?
They were very supportive. I just didn't spend time talking to them about the things I was thinking about intellectually. Socially, it was fine. We all got along pretty well. It just wasn't an intellectually stimulating place for me. And we got along fine. I just didn't socialize with them outside of the university. There were really none of them in the department that became friends in that other sense.
So where was the intellectual community? With your native colleagues and friends? Or was
I've always enjoyed conferences. I mean, I had already by then a pretty substantial network of people that I wanted to talk to as often as possible, and did that. And then when I went to a conference, usually Tanyik and I would both go, so Grandma would come out and stay with the kids, and that was fine too. So yeah, she was family in all.
When did you find time to write? You've had an extraordinary career in terms of publications and output. Were you writing at home on weekends and evenings, or early in the morning on Mondays in the office? What was your working style?
I've always been a night owl. So you finally get everybody settled down, and then you settle in and try to do some serious work. And always fits and starts. I wander around doing absolutely nothing for a while, and then spit out whatever I've been procrastinating about. I mean, it depends on what. And I've also always enjoyed being able to work in spurts, in the sense that you are thinking about something, whether it's from field work or from theoretical thinking, and you try it out on a class and it begins to make more sense, and then you do a conference paper, and then you revise that for some kind of publication, and it's a process of honing and talking to people about the kind of stuff that you're thinking about. Increasingly, I write as though I'm speaking, and then every once in a while I have to look at something that I'm supposed to be revising for publication and realizing I really have to make that a little more formal. This is not going to go over well in the audience that journals seem to expect.
So who were your academic and intellectual peers at that time in the 70s and into the early 80s when you were at Edmonton? What community were you part of intellectually?
I was largely still the ethnography of speaking fellow graduate students and some faculty, because I got back to Philadelphia frequently. Stayed with the former landlady who taught me to cook. That was all right. And added a few more to that very close network. Keith Basso would be one of those. Gillian Sankoff, who was then still in Canada. Influences at Penn that I guess I didn't mention from other departments. Irving Goffman and Bill LeBeuf were both there in those years and were part of the network around Dell. And so I had large doses of both of them. The last year I was there, Dell was on leave in England, and Joel Scherzer was teaching his courses. So Joel and I got to run the program for all of the other grad students in a strange kind of way. It was interesting trying to stand up to LeBeuf and Goffman on a point of principle And so we got first drafts of dissertation proposals that had a paragraph that sounded like it was written by each one of them. I mean, you kind of know, you have to make up your mind. You've got to do one thing or the other thing. But I learned from Irving that you really don't want to separate interaction and speech. He was forever nattering at us that speech was irrelevant in and of itself. And he's right about that, was right about that. He also thought that we couldn't do ethnography that would be anywhere near as sophisticated as what he knew about his own society. So what did he write about? The Shetland Islands, where he wasn't from, professional gambling, mental institutions. You kind of go, what? Are we, homosexuality? I mean, really, that's not one's own society or one's own intuitions. He was superbly intuitive. He could make sense out of stuff that was just fascinating. And LeBeuf, just this absolutely manic insistence on talking to everybody and listening to what they said and how they talked. And for me, it was the narrative rather than the phonological aspects of that work that were important. But it really was. And I got a modest dose of Philadelphia black culture along the way. Not enough to call it field work, but some exposure.
So these are quite strong intellectual influences on you, maybe for and against, or you're finding your own path through them. In the first part of your career at Edmonton, what kinds of contributions were you making to the field, and where were you positioning your own thinking?
Well, I published most of the dissertation in various revised articles. I couldn't face it as a total document. Eventually did put it together that way, but way after. I can't read my own prose easily until it sits for a long time and begins to sound like somebody else wrote it. And then I did a lot of sort of small things that reported on the field work. And then, of course, with the Doukhobor work, we did some papers about that and some modest dialectological work. And then we got involved in the multiculturalism stuff. All right. I went to Edmonton not long after the Royal Commission on Bilingualism and Biculturalism. One of the things it concluded is that we in the prairies don't think that French and English is really the point. So there ended up in the By and By report being a volume 4 called Other Languages. Okay. So by the time I got there and started looking for Canadian material to teach language and culture, I discovered there wasn't much. So I edited 3 books on Canadian languages and cultures, the theoretical point being that one can talk in the same way about charter languages, that is English and French, founding nation languages, and about immigrant languages, and about indigenous languages. The indigenous was actually the hardest one to make a point about because they are administratively under completely different auspices. So in principle, I could not get money for my work with Native people from the same people that were happy to pay me to play in the Doukhobor field or in more general kind of immigrant languages things. So, and of course the biculturalism and bilingualism, what we ended up with was still bilingualism. That is, only French and English really count. You're not bilingual if you speak Cree and English. You're bilingual if you speak French and English only. So you can be cultural, but you can't, multicultural, but you can't be multilingual in any official kind of sense. And that was fun because there was a huge kind of discourse across. Alberta was a good place to be interested in that kind of subject, which I was for a number of years in there.
Speaking of multilingualism, multiculturalism, did your children grow up speaking any other languages? Did they go to French immersion school or have a Slavic language from their father?
The only language their father and I shared was English, sadly. I wanted Grandma to teach the kids Cree, but her kids grew up, well, her daughter's son was 4 months older than my oldest, so they grew up in the same baby carriage, essentially, with Grandma rowing them around the block at her place. Her daughter did not want her child to learn Cree because she remembered how awful it was when she started school as a monolingual Cree speaker. So they heard the language a lot because Grandma would be talking to her friends and stuff. So it was around them and they heard it in terms of the field work, but none of them ever really learned to speak it. I would guess they understood more than either they or I would have thought, but they didn't use it. And I never tried to bill myself as a speaker of Cree because that wasn't my place, given the way those communities were in that stretch. They liked it that I tried and that I understood a lot of stuff. But I never got what I know about Cree grammatically and what I know about Cree by eavesdropping and following what people are talking about. That's easy, as long as you don't stop to translate. So I had that kind of fluency in a weird kind of way, not to respond but to listen. And then I could talk about the grammar because of teaching it with speakers for a long time. But they didn't meet in the middle. So I consider myself a monolingual, though I've tangled with a good many languages in one way or another.
I'm just struck also by the fact that you moved to Canada professionally and then your children were all born in Canada. Did you already begin to take on certain aspects of Canadian identity through the children's enculturation? Did you become Canadian soon after your arrival?
I think I'm still Canadian in a very used-to-be-American kind of way. It was that left guard that moved up in the Vietnam era, and most of us are Canadian citizens or dual citizens, as I am, and have been for a long time. But we didn't grow up Canadian, and it is different. Now, do I consider myself Canadian? Yes. But not in the same way as someone who grew up here.
Did you take on administrative responsibilities in your department as well, in Edmonton, quite early? Chair, head, or
almost
leading
none
programs?
At Alberta, and it was partly because the children's father had terrible difficulties with the Slavic linguistics department. They were doing pretty traditional linguistics, and he was trained in transformational grammar. And the chair of the department was very conservative, Germanic. It just didn't go well. So, yeah. So he eventually was fired, but sort of didn't get tenure. Yeah. And then we sued the university through several rounds of, anyway, we won. which paid off the mortgage on the acreage. But it was also really hard for him because we were doing work together, and I was getting rewarded for it by my department, and he was getting told that it had nothing to do with Slavic linguistics, that is, studying with the Doukhobor community. And of course, they don't speak standard Russian, which was the whole point. That's what was so interesting about it. And we ended up with a generational framework for language use and for their ideas about language retention in that community. It was neat stuff. But the Slavics department wasn't even faintly interested in it, and my department was. So we had our hands full between the fact that I had 4 kids in the 1970s, and the acreage, and the journal in the basement. Yeah.
What did your husband do after he was no longer employed at the university?
Now he ran the journal.
Uh-huh.
It wasn't easy for him, and that eventually is why we split. He had because of his background, he had to invent himself, starting with nothing and coming through the war zone stuff and the education, and he just didn't know how to cope with not being told he was wonderful at every stage. I don't know. Didn't go well. He died effectively on Skid Row a few years after we split. The kids and I were in Africa that summer with George. Anyway, complicated stuff. So, no, I didn't do a lot of administrative work there. I did develop the Cree language program, which was one course, and I suppose set some of the groundwork for the School of Native Studies. One of my first PhD students was the person that really made that happen. Crowley Ryan, whom I do still stay in touch with. He's a wonderful man and a dear friend. But he wasn't in anthropology, he was in education.
Does the Cree language program continue to this day? Is it?
No, well, yes, but not the way I did it. In 1985, the university established the School of Native Studies, and the first course they offered was Cree language, and it was taught by the son of one of the ladies who had been my collaborator and teacher in some of the early language revitalization work. So that was fabulous, really nice. I was doing that work hoping to put myself out of business eventually, and I did. So they now, I believe, offer 3 years of Cree, the last one being very philosophical and taught entirely in Cree. And I believe they also offer some other languages. We tried to make that happen the last couple of years I was at Alberta, but it didn't come together.
Were you quite involved in the curriculum development as well, the materials development for these classes?
Not in Native Studies. That was not my business. That was a program that was supposed to run on its own. I certainly developed the materials for the Cree that I taught with Grandma and other speakers. And basically we used a semantic domain approach so that we could talk about the world of hunting, the world of cuisine. What do you want to say about history? What do you want to say about kinship? And so on. And then appropriate vocabulary and conversation around it. People coming in to visit who spoke somewhat different dialects. There's a fair amount of minor dialect variation within Alberta Plains Cree, so some of the students had trouble with that. But we managed.
One of the things that has long struck me about your work is a long-term commitment to ethical collaborations and partnerships. In the 70s and then early 80s at your university, how was the institutional structure supportive or not supportive of collaboration, even perhaps co-authorship or co-publishing with some of your Indigenous intellectual colleagues?
I would have co-authored several things that I didn't, because it just wasn't a category at that point. I certainly acknowledged in the papers the people that I had worked with on them. I did a lot of collaborative work with academic colleagues, mostly people from grad school days. Published with Joel, certainly with Judy at various points. The collaboration in terms of the actual research, yeah, because they were the people that both knew their own communities and knew the language. So, yeah, I never saw myself as taking the lead in that, really. They were teaching me, and my job was to see if I could facilitate getting things to come together, which in many ways they did in a number of communities. So the ideas of how you work with people in a community were not new. As the climate changed and people began to actually talk about things that we knew already. I think the biggest lesson of that stretch was that sometimes you say, "You're not ready to do this yet. I'm going home. Give me a call if you get to the point where I can be useful to you." Because there was so much lack of consensus about one faction wants to have a language program. Who's going to teach it? What kind of language are we going to do? Are we going to emphasize writing or talking? And until that stuff settles, I don't want to be the person who decides. No, these are people I know through one or another context, so they know what I can offer. So, And sometimes it was, okay, we'll figure it out and get back to you pretty soon, and that happened, because that's the kind of process you need. If there's not consensus, there's no point. Things can happen very quickly once there is consensus. And then sometimes 5 years later you get a call out of a clear blue sky. "Hey, remember me? Or us?" "Yeah. You're still around. We thought maybe we'd like to do that. Not quite the way we talked about it then, but do it." "Okay." And so I would trundle up and talk to them about it. And I had a day job, so it was okay to be able to do that. No, there was always plenty to do. I remember in grad school wondering if I'd run out of things to do research on. That has not happened.
You just alluded to George, I think your third husband.
Yes.
When did you meet him, and when did he become part of your life and your family?
Well, I met him not too long after the children's father and I split through one of my grad students. And his childhood sweetheart, wife of 30 years or so, had died about a year ago of a heart attack. So it certainly wasn't a weird switch. Anyway, we became friends first and eventually more. And it was very nice.
What was his name?
George Ozerai, Hungarian, very Hungarian. His father was an Austro-Hungarian military officer, impoverished, World War I hero, I guess. Then during the Second World War, the family smuggled Jews out of Budapest. There are 3 trees in Israel to members of that family. His father and older brother being 2 of them. He was the youngest of 6 children. And tried to leave in 1956 with wife and daughter, but his mother-in-law sent away the person who came to help them leave, so it didn't happen. But he took a job with the UN in India a few years later, 1966 maybe. 2 years in India and never went home on the way back. And then came to Edmonton to work for the Research Council. He was a hydrogeologist doing water mapping stuff. He liked to make maps, which was kind of fun. And so he knew all those funny little towns in northern Alberta as well as I did, but for different reasons and very different ways of going about it.
Did he accompany you on fieldwork trips?
A number, yes. as did the children, often. They sort of grew up with, oh, okay, where are we going now? And we had a lot of people who came to stay with us on their way through town, so it was always a permeable boundary, shall we say.
And did he become an active father to the 4 children?
I think he always considered them my children, but yes, he was the game in town. When I met him, Karen was 2.5, so they were 2, 4, 6, and 8. So I think it was the hardest for the oldest because he thought he had to be the man of the family. And I really tried hard not to have him feel that way, but he did for a number of reasons. The 2 younger ones, it was much easier for them to switch over to that, which is good. And yes, we were a family. But he didn't argue with me about basic decisions about the kids either, though we certainly talked about stuff. And we always included the kids in making decisions. That didn't mean that we or I didn't make them ultimately, but it did mean we found out what everybody thought about it first, which is very different from how I was raised.
At a certain point in your career, your research interest became entirely global, and you've worked in many different disciplines, but also, you mentioned already, in Africa. Can you describe a little bit the steps, the processes perhaps, that led to these opportunities that you then took and contributed to?
George and I got married. He proposed to me in Lima. And
in which year?
82, no, 83. Fall of 83. He had sold, maybe late summer, he had sold a piece of land, quarter acre, half acre, and had money in his pocket. So where do you want to go? Anywhere in the world? I don't know. I go places where there are conferences and somebody will pay me to go there. And then I try to travel before and after. So anyway, he eventually picked Peru. And I thought that was just fine, of course. We had a lovely time. He was looking at erosion patterns and I was looking at people. We had fun. 2 completely different ways of seeing the world from background and training. And so we decided, for I think tax reasons, that we wouldn't get married until January, first week in January of 84, I guess it would have been. And 3 months after we got married, with the children as our attendants and me, the children thought that getting married was as important as it was to him. Being a very conservative European gentleman, we ought to get married. Okay. Not on the assumption that we wanted to have more children. That wasn't it. It was just that, that's what you do. And it was important to the kids, too. So, white dress, in the church. I found a sort of granny gown hippie thing for $35 in a vintage shop, and then went out and paid $125 for a veil. But that's okay. The reception back at the acreage was catered by the bride for 125 people. It was fun. It was. We had a lot of native friends there. We had a lot of people from the university there. I invited the whole department, and most of them came. It was a nice party. One of my students made the cakes. I don't bake, I cook. So there were 4 huge loaf cakes with the same batter but different icings. The kids tell me they tried all 4 flavors. They probably did. So then 3 months later, he took a job with the UNDP in Banjul, the Gambia, West Africa, and wandered off to the Gambia. So we spent a lot of time writing letters over the next 3 years. The kids and I spent 3 summers in Banjul when they got off school, which was fabulous for all of us. And another one of those, wow. I remember sending a postcard that first summer to my friend Judy from grad school and saying, Judy, these people are not American Indians. Love, Regna. She thought that was hilarious. I kind of did too, actually. But it was very strange. The whole style was so wildly different all those things of etiquette and reticence and indirection that I had spent 15 years absorbing made me look like a complete unfriendly, unapproachable kind of person in local terms there. And so we had to negotiate a whole bunch of stuff. And then I found the hierarchy very difficult, both within the indigenous societies, various of them, and certainly within the expatriate community, where we just did not behave like the rest of them. Georgie was also marched to his own drummer and not a company man sort of person. At one point, the UNDP sent one of their senior people around to chat with him about how he perhaps shouldn't let his children play with the local black children. He said something on the order of, "My children will play with whoever they please, and if you want to send me home, that'll be fine. We'll all go back home." That was the end of that. But they, of course, found people and got involved in what was going on. There were often 7 languages spoken in our compound in a given day. We had a Mandinka driver who was in and out all the time, and our gardener was Jola, and there were a couple of other local languages, and then of course there were the Wolof from Senegal, because the Gambia is this tiny little stretch of British water rights in the middle of French Senegal. So, and then of course Arabic and French and English, all of which you heard all the time. So we didn't learn a local language there either. But the kids acquired a dialect of English almost instantly, which was recognizably Banjo, which I always thought was interesting. I think I did too, to a point, but not to the extent that they did.
And did you write and study and research some of the local communities as well during your time there?
Well, now that was awkward. I certainly couldn't study anything about, the work that Judy had done on Wolof. I wrote one paper formally about that stuff, although anecdotally used the material in other ways. But the paper was about 3 donkeys and a windmill. It was an excursion to a community that was complaining that the blades had fallen off this windmill and killed 3 donkeys. And so I did this long thing explaining the cultural absurdities of the way in which the UN interacts. First of all, they send them up there with nobody who speaks the local language except the driver, who knows absolutely nothing about water rights or windmills. Okay? So, our driver, Konyachi would do anything you ask him to, so, okay, he's talking to them, but God knows what he's saying. So I wrote this paper that I thought was hilariously funny because when we came back, there was an African Studies conference in Edmonton that year, and I gave the paper. So all the African students on campus had come to this conference, and they were howling with laughter at the proper moments, whereas most of my academic colleagues looked like they really didn't understand what we were doing here. I felt good about that. So I think I got the hang of it in some interesting way. However, and that was published in the selected proceedings of that conference, of which I don't think I even have a copy anymore. But I do have a copy of the paper, and I still like it.
So did you use these times in the summer in Africa or other periods as a way to reflect on fieldwork and write up some of the articles that then would be published next year? Were you using it as a kind of mini sabbatical cocoon?
What I was supposed to be doing at that point was writing a biography of Edward Sapir. So the children and I got on airplanes with wads, each of them with wads of books and computers and things and documents. And so, in principle, I spent a lot of time working on that stuff. But we also spent a lot of time, every afternoon we'd go down to the beach and swim for an hour. And then we would wander off to the market to find something for dinner. And, it was just very... And the household was essentially the gardener's family plus ours. So it was very interactive a lot of the time, but I wasn't doing field work.
Mm.
You can't turn off the way you think about what's going on around you. And then at some point, David Sapir, who had been at Penn when I was there, turned up to visit us with his family. They were in Dakar for the summer and came through on their way to the Casamance in the south. And David, as my kids went by, had a fit. What language are they speaking? This was their local dialect of English. And it was just, I don't know, he must have sat in a hotel room and talked to people. Because he just really didn't seem to understand what was going on. And then he was trying to lecture the gardener's kids in Jola, and they weren't impressed. Neither was the gardener. Anyway, different worlds. Different ways of being a linguist, I guess. And I was never, even if I had been there working, I wouldn't have been doing it in that way. David's dissertation was a grammar of Jola. And his real thing was music.
Speaking of music and hobbies and passions, I know you like to cook, and you do so with great pleasure and gusto for your colleagues, your students, your friends. Have you had other passions and hobbies that have kept you together in difficult times, whether music or art, religion, walking? What has kept you and held you during transitions?
The Quaker Philadelphia ethical stance, as opposed to religious one, was important in the Philadelphia years. When I went to Edmonton, there wasn't any, so I didn't go to church at all on that stretch. And then at some point decided, for the kids' sake, that I probably ought to do something again, so we kind of became Anglicans. And I found that I had some very interesting intellectual conversations with some Anglican clergy on the left-wing end of things. So there were some good friends from that, and until quite recently I have considered myself, I guess, a practicing Anglican. But my way of doing that is idiosyncratic, I think we could say.
Can you describe it a little?
I'm not actually very interested in institutions. I like the idea of ritual, and I like the idea of community. And a community other than the one at work, it's nice. There's something to be said for that. People I would not necessarily know otherwise. The church that I've been a member of here closed about a year or two ago, and I have not found myself able to consider looking for another one. It won't be Anglican. I'm extremely unhappy with how that all went down. So, and the priest who was a good friend died about a year ago. So that's just gone. Although I keep track of a few people that I knew in that context. The kids went to church until they were confirmed at basically adolescence. And after that, it was up to them, except that when we were still living in Alberta, we had to drive into town for church. And if they didn't come, they would miss going out to lunch and going roller skating or swimming afterwards. So they were devout churchgoers in those days. Although they took up working in the baby fold with rather more enthusiasm than sitting in the service. They have some rather strange descriptions of the Sunday school program, some of which I've heard only in their adulthood, but that's okay. Yeah, so certainly since we've been here, none of them. My deal with them is I will not pester you if you turn up en masse for Christmas Eve and Easter Sunday. I will not nag to go to church the rest of the time. And they've kept that pretty well over the years, which is nice, as the family grows. Yeah.
After 20 or 21 years at the University of Alberta in Edmonton, you took a position here in London, Ontario, at Western University. I'm sure you had other offers before then to move as well. What kept you in Edmonton until that point, and what made you think to leave when you did?
Well, the fieldwork, primarily. I mean, I had deep ties in northern Alberta communities. I like the idea of living where you work. It makes things so much simpler and so much less field, home, work, none of which I've really ever separated in any firm sense. Well, my oldest son was 16 the year I was offered a job here, and the traditional department in London has been very oriented to the kinds of things I do. I was not aware how much it was about to change, but that's okay. They bought me in one sense. I mean, it was really lovely raise. But in another, it was just, if I ever wanted to move anywhere outside Edmonton, it would have to have been then, or my oldest son would not have come with us. And I don't think I did want to stay. I was beginning to think that there was far too much influence from a kind of conservative, I would classify as redneck, Alberta culture, that I did not want them to turn into. And there was a limit to what the things I exposed them to would do confronted with that. So it seemed like a very good kind of time to try something else.
Had you already been promoted to full professor in Alberta?
Yeah, I became a full professor in 1979 and stayed at Alberta till 90. They had a very much weigh your publications and scorecard for when you came up for promotion. And so I went through that very rapidly because I did publish a lot in those early years.
Did you also take on administrative tasks at the university and agitate for some of the benefits, such as maternity leave policies for
I
junior
really
colleagues?
didn't do anything officially administrative. When I came to Western as department chair, however, it was a rather different matter.
Were you hired into the role here as chair?
Yeah.
You were the incoming chair.
That's about the only way you move at my level. Some kind of administrative position. And I did that for 3 years and withdrew my application to continue. I didn't get along with the dean of the day at all, and withdrew my application to run for and be acclaimed to president of the Faculty Association, which I gathered didn't please her a lot. But I thought it was just fun.
What was the hardest thing to leave behind in Edmonton?
Grandma.
Did she visit here?
No, but we tried to see her when we could get back. And kept that up as long as we could. And she was around.
And how different is the culture of this university and this town to that of Edmonton and the University of Alberta?
Well, this is Empire Loyalist country. The old London has a very kind of British WASP flavor, as does the neighborhood I live in. The city is multi-ethnic and much more complicated, but its neighborhoods are strangely isolated. And I don't have a lot of contact outside the university circles. I don't have time to. Mostly because of those administrative positions. And the kids, however, I thought, oh, this will be nice. We'll live in this nice neighborhood, and they'll make friends that, yeah, all right. They found people who lived at every end of the city and beyond. I don't know how they did it, but they came in with some of the most amazing folks in terms of what we now call diversity. Geniuses. They didn't like the public school. It's Mom, they're all snobs. We need to teach them how to be with people. Okay, then. The boys were all athletes, so their high school careers went quite smoothly, for the most part. I mean, we had lots of little trouble with 4 teenagers. There is lots of little commotion, but basically they all survived it quite nicely.
So what were the biggest challenges coming into being a chair of a department that you didn't know in a province that you had not lived and worked in before, and also never having had these kinds of senior administrative responsibilities at your home university? It must have been quite a change of gear.
Oh, well, yes, but I had a couple of old friends from my conference hopping and various other endeavors in the department already, so that made life immensely easier. And I almost immediately applied for shirk funding with my colleague Lisa Valentine, now using Phillips. She went back to her maiden name. And we started studying English as spoken by Haudenosaunee and Anishinaabe people in this part of Ontario, because we live here, we might as well figure it out. Her field work had been with Northern Ontario, Ojibwe, and mine, of course, with Cree and Northern Alberta. So we had a looking at urban speech and the stuff that was around small communities in this area that we could work from knowing something about much more isolated and traditional places, and I think that was the right way to go. So we ended up with 3 consecutive Shirk Standard Research Grants to do that work, and had a lot of students, came together with a network of very interesting students that we worked with together through those years. At that point, the department had only a master's program. I thought I was hired to start a PhD program, as did the committee that hired me, but the dean didn't. So we expanded to a full 4-field department. Well, actually, no, we expanded into archaeology and biological anthropology. She was a biological anthropologist, and she managed to get rid of the linguistics department, or the linguistics prong of the program, by dumping half of it in the Faculty of Arts in the French department, which we're still stuck with. Very strange kinds of things. So you sort of, okay, what I thought I was going to do is not going to happen, so let's find something else to entertain ourselves, basically, and look for something interesting to think about and some people to work with. Initially, that was through the Center for the Study of Theory and Criticism, which is a really neat interdisciplinary program. The summer I came here, I was staying with my colleague Carol Farber, who was going to teach a course for them in the fall of 1990. And I sat in on it because it sounded so cool, and got to know that generation of students and found myself up to my eyeballs in core faculty of that then virtually brand new program. And I still hold that position and still do a lot of core committee work for the Theory Center.
It sounds like you found quite quickly an intellectual life and vitality.
Oh, it's
here
wonderful.
At this university.
People to talk to about theory, I never had that before. On a day-to-day kind of basis. So, yeah, intellectually, I have more close friends that are people I've met in that context than any other.
What was the history and position of the Department of Anthropology at Western when you came? What did it stand for? What had been its achievements?
Well, they billed themselves for a long time as symbolic anthropology. But that, for a variety of reasons, that really changed a lot, and some people left, and the addition of much more 4-field or 3-field kind of stuff made a difference. Mark Sagan, who had been the primary linguist when I came, left to move out west after a couple of years. Lisa eventually went somewhere else too. So, it's just, where are you going to do what? Then I got involved with women's studies because the university was uncomfortable with a standpoint-based program, I think. And although they had students and ran courses, there was a lot of hesitation for them becoming a department. And so the vast majority of the senior women in social sciences and humanities signed on as affiliate faculty as they emerged as a department. And I still hold that affiliate appointment too. So people come to review the program, and boy, do they have an impressive faculty, although most of us don't teach or don't teach regularly in the program. I get a fair number of grad students that come and take my courses. Not every year, but many. And I do guest gigs for them periodically. But that's not a real active one. But it is important to me because they have, I think, some really good people. And if they hadn't had some backup from women on campus, they would not have been able to develop the program, the very good program they have now. They have a CRC who's fabulous, and that's given them a lot of stature, too. So that's good.
For somebody who just described herself as not particularly interested in institutions, in your time at Western, you've actually built a great deal, whether it be, I think, founding the First Nation Studies program.
Yeah, I was going to get to that one next. Yeah, I don't think it's a contradiction. Institutions are supposed to facilitate things. I like to run things. Actually, I don't. I have, on a good day, perhaps a 3-year attention span for any kind of administrative job. I don't have it in me to do it for a long time. It takes you a year to figure out what's going on. Then you kind of settle in and do it, and by the 3rd year it's getting a little, why am I doing this? It's a waste of time. The First Nations thing was, well, my first impression when I got here was this place is 30 years behind the prairies in anything indigenous. Just nothing going on at Western. And Western had a terrible reputation among Native communities as being just not about them, despite the mandate to serve this part of the province, which has a fair number of communities, to put it mildly. And so we had a dean who, I think he must have heard a rumor I was thinking of leaving or something, because he invited me to lunch and asked me what it would take to make me happy. And I said, well, we need a First Nations program. And he said, okay, write a curriculum. We'll offer the first course the following year. Okay. So we did that.
Were you unhappy?
No, not particularly. I mean, I don't know what brought that on. I really don't know. I couldn't. I mean, for what it's worth, I couldn't have left Western. My family's here. I treasure the fact that 2 of my 4 children live in the city, and 1 is in under 2-hour drive, if you drive at the speeds he does, not in traffic hours. And my daughter, I think, is in Toronto, but we are not in touch with her at the moment. She's finding her way, I hope. And yeah, so that works out okay. And it means that I see 5 of my 6 grandchildren for Sunday dinner almost every week, if I'm in town and they are. And
you did move at the right time, didn't you, for your family, as you've indicated before?
Well, that was the reason.
It was then, or
not.
Not at all.
Yeah. And I think it's worked out well. That first year they were uncomfortable about not going home. They'd gone other places and lived other places. They weren't nervous about coming to London. But not going back home bothered them. So we told them that they could come and stay with any friend of their choice whose parents would put up with it for 2 weeks in the summer after that first year we were here. And we did that. We drove across. Georgie and I had a lovely week with a former student of mine who has a Finnish woman who had a large house with a sauna in the basement. And we had a lovely holiday with them. That was nice. And the next year the kids were settled enough here that that didn't seem to be an issue. But we go back a long way in this town now. Some of the boys' friends from high school still stop to see me when they're in town, because I always preferred to have them in our basement rather than running around the city. So we had a lot of kids in our basement for a good many years. And we had a policy on runaways when the oldest was about 13 or 14, I guess. You must call your parents. I will talk to them after you do. Assuming they agree, you may stay here while you get your act in gear. And we did that for a lot of people.
Regna, you've served not only as head of department and director of the First Nation Studies program, but also on the Board of Governors, and I believe on the Faculty Association. Can you tell me a little bit about what motivated you to take on those responsibilities and what work you did in those roles?
Well, the first time I got involved was just because the women's network I joined when I came to Western needed someone that would be willing to serve on the on the board of the Faculty Association. I agreed to do that, and I liked some of the people I met through that very much indeed. So I got involved, and in that stretch, it was really very difficult because the university had a document that was in theory negotiated, but in practice there was no mechanism. After the negotiations, the university could do whatever it pleased, and that wouldn't do. And the other thing was that people didn't have to be members of the Faculty Association. And so we were basically spending down our surplus, and it wasn't viable. On either, we had to have mandatory dues, and we had to have something other than binding supplication. So, to the astonishment of our administration, we managed to win a union vote. I feel I had an important part in that, and that it was worth doing. I'm not, in principle, a great union person, but I do think if your employer isn't listening to you, you need to find a way to make that point. And I mean, again, it goes back to my Bryn Mawr days when the administration was faculty members, distinguished people who had made a name in their fields and who understood the work of the academic part of the institution, not professional administrators. And that's what we have almost entirely above the level of chair in most large universities in Canada today, and it proliferates in every possible direction. And less of the resources of the institution go to the teaching and the research profile. And I find that really demoralizing. So I did a second stretch as president of the Faculty Association a few years back, and was at that point under the union rules, of course. And at that point, I was becoming really discouraged about where decisions got made, because they certainly weren't in the negotiations between the union and the administration. So I thought maybe the Board of Governors was the place where things happened. That turned out not to be true either. The administration brings in their version of stuff to people who don't know much about the university otherwise. And I mean, I entertained the board with my antics for 4 happy years, trying to defend the position of humanities and social sciences as opposed to the STEM disciplines that seem to get so much more attention. Western, actually, if you talk about quality, has a much higher reputation in humanities and social sciences. But that's quality, it's not money. And rhetorically, I got along brilliantly because I had recently gotten a very large grant when I was on the board. And so when we get this administrative nose in the air kind of well. And then there are the social sciences and humanities people with their $1,000 a year operating grant. Yes, mine is $2.5 million. Now then, could we talk about... Anyway. One just has to keep coming back with no, we're not going to define it that way. We're going to talk about the things that make this a university. And I'm not popular with many of my colleagues in science and medicine, to put it mildly, because they really do think that the only real research is the STEM disciplines, and I think they're wrong. They're different kinds of research.
Noting, as you have, the proliferation of non-academic management positions at the level usually above chair, so deans, provosts, etc. Were you ever tempted to take on those responsibilities? I can imagine that with your profile, you would have had offers to be a dean or an associate dean, perhaps a deputy provost. And how have you managed to avoid them if you didn't want them?
Well, actually, I'm too much of a wild card to be anyone's idea of an ideal administrator. Chairs are supposed to work for their bosses. And even at the chair level, I really didn't. I was much more interested in my colleagues and my students than I was in the dean's priorities. And certainly above the decanal level, I would not have been a well-behaved administrator. I might well have applied for something at another institution, but I didn't ever want to do that. Why would you want to escape the work you do? I mean, it makes no sense. I'm a teacher and a writer and a reader. Really now. I've administered things because they needed to be done and because I felt strongly about how they should be done. And then gone off and done something else for a while. And it has seemed to work out pretty well that way.
I've heard you speak of the hedgehog and the fox, Isaiah Berlin. Would you just share with me a little your perspective on that and where you situate yourself on this continuum?
Yeah, well, I always thought of myself as a fox. I bound about and think about things, and when I begin to see how they fall into place and what the pattern is, I want to go on to something else, and that's true. But over the last maybe decade or so, I think I have a lot of hedgehog too. The things that have been important to me and the things that I have consistently engaged in have been pretty stable over almost 5 decades of university teaching and research. And so I think it's somewhere in between. I used to joke butterfly, that I kind of wander in and out. And it is true that if you ask me what I'm doing or what I've done, the odds are I'll start telling you about my latest project, because in some sense I'm always engaged in what I'm engaged in right now.
What is that project now for you?
Well, there are a couple of them, as there are. One is the Franz Boas Papers documentary edition, the large grant. But that's complicated too, because some of it is archival and partnership between the American Philosophical Society and the University of Nebraska Press and a number of indigenous community partners in British Columbia. And so it's fieldwork, in a sense. Certainly community research. I don't know that I would really call it fieldwork anymore, but certainly working with scholars and leaders in a variety of communities as partners in the work, with the intention to figure out respectful protocols for treating sensitive materials and for digital knowledge sharing that brings stuff back from distant places and makes it available for contemporary use, as in Boas's texts and stuff, unpublished stuff that sits at the APS and no one knows what it is, never mind, has seen it. And the third would be community capacity building, and we've been able to support a number of Indigenous students from mostly the University of Victoria, which has been a pleasure. So I've gotten to know those people and that set of communities. We also work with some people at the Union of British Columbia Indian Chiefs in the interior, and that too is a pleasure and a privilege. I've learned a great deal from all of them. So it's a kind of third Indigenous area, I guess. And again, I'm never going to, excuse me, I'm never going to have the depth appreciation there. But it goes all the way back to my first course in anthropology that I had to go with that part of the world and thought about it. So that feels good. Freddie must have rolled over in her grave when I got to speak on the floor of a potlatch. Neither she nor I would ever have thought that would happen. But it did. And for the Boas Project, not for anything about me personally. I consider myself the chief herder of cats in this very complicated project. And I've had a chance to work with some really fabulous people. So anyway, the community stuff and the academic stuff really are closely related. And at the APS, I serve on their Advisory Committee for Native American Languages that has revised the protocols for getting permission to cite documents in their Native American collections, which again has been a real treat to be involved in, and I've met some great people doing that too. But it all becomes a piece. Now, in terms of life in London, I have also gotten involved with ecosystem health initially in the Schulich School of Medicine and Dentistry, where particularly the community of Wapelauan First Nation, which is in the at the edge of the St. Clair River, below Sarnia's Chemical Valley. So there's obviously concern with environmental toxins, to put it mildly. They have very good environmental data back to the mid-70s, but they know almost nothing, or did when we began, about the human health effects of that stuff. So the trick was to work out a way to talk about both environment and health, and to talk about how, from my point of view anyway, to talk about how indigenous knowledge might package those concepts in a different way than the biomedical system. I don't know that I would call that field work, but it has certainly been collaborative research since the early 90s. Actively at Walpole Island with the colleagues from the medical school since about 2003. And we've done some very interesting and very sciencey studies of biomonitoring of hair and blood samples to be able to do some kind of profile of what the environmental effects are. One of the interesting pieces of that is that the stress levels are demonstrably higher by measuring hair cortisol than what you find in the nearby population, which shows us all kinds of things about the importance of perception of toxic dangers. And the health conditions, it doesn't show up in everybody the same way, but if you assume that stress increases vulnerability because it decreases immunity, then you begin to see something that makes a bit of sense. Obviously, not the only stressor in the community is the environmental stuff, but it's definitely one of them. People worry about it, about what we've called chemophobia, a lot. So we've been able to get a handle on some of those things and try to do dietary studies, looking at fish consumption and looking at the fish. What's in them? Which fish do you want to eat? How many of them? Do you want to drink the water? Is the problem the land or the air or the air, water, land? Three. Anyway, all right. And so we've been able to do some really interesting things. There's a project to look at arsenic and methylmercury levels that I was down there just last week doing some new sampling. It's, I think, the hardest fieldwork I've ever done, the fieldwork I've done with my colleagues in the medical school, because they are socialized to have such a science, our science, biomedical science, is a thing which has an existence and a truth value that is not subject to question. And that means they come off in ways that are, just by definition, patronizing and annoying to community members. And Walpole Island's a fascinating community because they want to work with people who have this scientific knowledge, and they invite scientists in. But there are also points where it becomes extremely difficult when you're trying to see a side of it in which environment and health are both conceived in very different ways than they are by the biomedical folks. So I'm the translator. He said, no, that's, did you hear what this person just said to you? Okay, for a simple example, you're going to give a talk with all the statistics about the results of the last set of sampling stuff. And you come in and start throwing around jargon that I had to learn by saying, what does that mean? And so my first intervention, we are going to begin with the glossary on your PowerPoint. These are not people who can't think about these issues. They think about them all the time, but they don't use those words. So let's make sure we're all bilingual here, and then we can have a conversation. Okay, and to increasingly to make it a user-friendly science. My position is that the biomedical science can do stuff that there's no question. First of all, they can give us a larger sample. How are we going to tell how high the stress levels are if we don't have a control population to compare? And there's just all kinds of wonderful data that you can draw in to understand what you're finding out locally. But it's reductionist. You make a narrow little package of what you're going to be able to study, and you study it. And you publish a paper which presents the results but does not talk about what they might mean, because you can't prove that from your numbers, which is where I get interested. And you have no time frame. They sort of go, oh, we can go all the way back to 1973 for monitoring of the water. It's not very long. They've been there for thousands of years. Okay. When you talk to the people who are traditional hunters and trappers and fishers on the island, and you ask them to tell you about what their experience has been over their lifetime, and about the things that they were taught by their fathers, grandfathers, and so on, there is a completely different level of understanding of what's happening to that environment. And when you put the two together, you get something that neither one of them could do alone. That's where we're trying to work. So all of that has gotten me into public health, where I got dragooned into being part of the core planning team for a program in public health that had a lot of its roots in ecosystem health. So my cross appointment is to the Department of Pathology, which seems a little strange, but that's where they put us. And public health is now in its fourth year. We're interviewing for our fifth class. I team taught in the program for the first 2 years of its existence, both times with student or former student. One of my former students is in that program now. And the work we've done at Walpole Island is now attempting to make a generational transfer from the bunch of us senior people who started that sort of work quite some time ago as senior then, to be able to say, all right, we need younger scholars who are going to carry this on, and we have a relationship with the community which is ongoing in a way that the particular individuals involved are not. And that's coming together really nicely at this point. And I should acknowledge by name, if I'm naming, Dr. Dean Jacobs, who has been the core of the science program, and the balancing act that it takes to do that at Walpole Island is a wonderful collaborator and a good friend. He and I and the young scholar that we have coming up in public health co-authored a paper recently, and I really think it's one voice. And he was the one to put it that way, Dean, that is. So I think we're creating some really exciting kinds of things that are not research with human subjects. They are attempts to understand and to establish conversations with people.
It's a lovely way to reflect on 50 years of relationships and commitments. Could I ask you, as you look forward now, and to the many students you've inspired, many who are still around you and come to take your classes, come to have dinner with you, and are part of your life, what counsel would you give them as they forge careers and try and find a path into a complex academic space?
Well, I think we're living on the cusp of a revolution of ideas and presumably also of society. The old kind of positivism model doesn't work anymore. It works for some things, but there's so many it doesn't. So we need to learn to think in terms of nonlinear patterning, chaos, complexity, and we need to see how those things work out in human terms. And both the intellectual work and the community relationships that are going to be engaged in doing that are really an exciting space. It crosses disciplines. I think anthropology is a wonderful place for it just because we're already pre-adapted to complexity. You can do almost anything and say it's anthropology. Many of my colleagues tell me, I'm not interested in what you're doing now. But they won't tell me it's not anthropology. Almost no one has ever told me that what I do isn't anthropology. And I've changed my mind about what I do in the topic term and sense a number of times over my career, but I have not changed the way I think about it, I don't think. And so it seems to me that I would want to tell a student, and I do tell them, if you think this is fun, then you go for it. If this is going to make a difference in the world, if you do it this way, then you want to do that. Will you ever get rich? Not in money, probably. Will you ever be a rich human being? Almost certainly. And that's really a great deal more important. I think there's a place for my idea of what a university is, and for people who move between such an intellectual world and the knowledge that comes from communities in different kinds of ways and that tries to make them come together.
Is there anything else you'd like to put on the record and talk about before we bring this wonderful conversation to a close?
Well, we missed all of my editing antics. That's another one of my... it really doesn't matter if I publish 3 more papers this year. Nobody cares, including me in one sense. The things that I write I certainly want to use and to have people have access to, but that's not the priority. So in History of Anthropology, I edit a Critical Studies in History of Anthropology with my colleague and dear old friend Steve Murray. I edit a journal called Histories of Anthropology with another of my dear old friends, Fred Leach, who was at Cornell. We have Volume 11 will be out shortly. And we've managed to redefine history of anthropology in the scope of the journal in ways that many historians would not be comfortable with. We have a lot of stuff that comes out of oral tradition that we are considering history, community members writing about their communities, anthropologists writing about their relationships to communities. Some of it's conventional history, but the kind of standpoint-based approach to ethnographic writing and to the positioning of an anthropologist, I consider a question of the history of the discipline. We've tried to, it's a surprising amount of it is not dealing with Native North America, given that both Fred and I work primarily in that space. But other things have come in from different directions, and we've tried to be serious about that, histories, plural. And also about the fact that past, present, and future are not categories of experience. They are arbitrary discriminations. So that the past is in the present in any indigenous system of thought. And the future is then always becoming. So if we have a complexity theory where we talk about what my dear old friend Dennis Tedlock used to call the dialogic emergence of culture, that's where it is. That's where those conversations come, and that's what we keep doing. So the editing, both, more of it has been in history of anthropology, but, it's it's really important to have places for especially younger scholars to be able to make their work known and available. We've published a lot of stuff in the journal by graduate students, and we've encouraged a number of rewritten dissertations in the monograph series. And of course, the press is also doing the Boas documentary edition. So there's a real kind of synergy that's making history of anthropology a serious field to contribute to the thought of the discipline as well as to its factual base. I like that. It's part of the practice for me.